Tonight, we're going to hear about fire in the boreal forests of northern Minnesota. Fire regimes in northern Minnesota create a mosaic of different forest types on the landscape. And we're going to look at how fire behavior creates these patterns, interactions of fire with other disturbances, such as windstorms and climate change impacts on the disturbance regime. Our presenter, Lee Frelich, is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology, and he's written more than 195 publications with 285 co-authors from 25 different countries. He's listed among the top 1% of all scientists in the world in ecology and environmental category by the Web of Science. He consults on forest management for the U.S. Army, the Air Force, the National Forest Service, and the National Park Service. And currently he's doing research in large-scale fire and wind, earthworm invasion, and climate change in temperate and boreal forests. So he's extremely knowledgeable about this, and we've heard a little bit about him when we've had presenters on boundary waters fires in the past. So welcome, Lee. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation tonight.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. Let me share my screen. All right, well, I'm going to talk about the far northern forests that we have in Minnesota, which are pretty comparable to what we have across central Canada, and even in some ways similar to what we have in Alaska, in central Alaska. And in central Siberia, for that matter. So let's get right into it here. And you all know the boundary waters, of course, with the purple cross-hatching here, nestled within the Superior National Forest and also Quetico Provincial Park and Voyageurs National Park. So altogether, there's 2.5 million acres of wilderness here, and then several million acres of surrounding land that's kind of semi-wild. That I'm going to focus on, and it has several parts. So the first part is Bud Heinzelman's classic research on large-scale fires. So I inherited one of the best data sets ever produced in the world in the history of fire ecology from Bud when he died in 1991, including all of his maps, which, by the way, have all now been digitized and are available through the Digital Conservancy at the University of Minnesota. Not only the big maps like you see here that show the area burned for each century, but also the topographic maps, 52 topos that show the fine scale details of the ages of the forest. So what did Bud tell us that was so groundbreaking? Well, first of all, he spent about 20 summers canoeing around the boundary waters, coring trees to see how old they were for species that germinate after fires, like birch and aspen and red pine and black spruce. Also was able to look at fire scars, and red pine is the premier species there because they can have several scars and they can live for hundreds of years after being scarred by a fire. And you can count the number of years from the outside of the tree back to each scar. So you can get the dates, you can see what the average interval between fires is, and so on. So you see him here coring a red pine on 3 Mile Island in Seagull Lake that turned out to date to 1595. And there were actually 4 of those big red pines, and 3 of them blew down in the big blowdown of 99, and 1 survived the prescribed burn the Forest Service did after the blowdown, and then got struck by lightning and died because it was the tallest thing in Seagull Lake at that point. So from all of this data that Bud made and all these maps, we know that jack pine forests, often mixed with some aspen and some black spruce, had high intensity. Well, not only had, they still have high intensity crown fires that are tens of thousands of acres in size. So fires like the Greenwood fire we had this summer, or the Pagami Creek fire we had in 2011, perfectly normal fires in the history of the boundary waters. They are documented and mapped to occur over the centuries from the late 1500s up to the current time. So these fires kill all of the mature trees, but the seeds of serotinous cones, which don't open unless they're scorched by a fire, that you see here on the bottom, closed cones of jack pine, and you see 3 years worth of cones there, the youngest ones being at the right, and then 2-year-old and then 3-year-old. They can have up to 9 years worth of cones with viable seeds on the tree. So when a fire does occur, millions of seeds per acre are ready to go. They've been through a winter, they've been cold stratified. They just need to get out of the cone. Black spruce has semi-serotinous cones. There's a clump of them at the top of the tree that stays closed, but there are a few cones that open every year and shed a few seeds. But you do get massive reproduction of black spruce right alongside jack pine after these fires. And here's germination in the upper left there, just 3 months after a fire, which was in May, and then by mid to late summer, you already have germination of jack pines. And then the pictures, the bottom 2 pictures show 3 years later, and you see the young jack pines there mixed with some aspen and also black spruce seedlings. So in that picture with the black spruce seedling on the lower right there, you've got black spruce, you've got jack pine, you've got blueberries there, and bristly sarsaparilla are those seeds in the upper part of the picture. So all 4 of those species are fire-dependent species. And then here's what the forest looks like at age 17. In the upper picture, notice all the standing dead wood, tons and tons per acre of standing and fallen dead wood. A lot of the trees have fallen by then, but some are still standing. And when you're growing a forest on a slab of granite, like most of the boundary waters, as those logs rot, the roots of the trees grow into them and they actually become part of the soil. And those that are still standing, of course, become habitat for many species of fungi and insects and cavity nesting birds and all sorts of species. And then by age 50, in the bottom picture, you have a high density, even age stand of jack pine, and anywhere from 50 to 100 years old was when they would normally burn again. And you can see the high density of foliage there would easily carry a crown fire. So that's the jack pine. They tend to live, jack pine and black spruce, they live in large swaths of the landscape where the lakes are pretty small and fires can sweep across the landscape. High intensity fires, tens of thousands of acres in size, every 50 to 100 years. But there are other fire regimes in the boundary waters. One of the others is white and red pine stands. They have a little bit less than average fire intensity. They tend to grow on peninsulas, islands, and lake shores where the ruggedness of the topography prevents a very uniform, dense canopy, and fires have a more difficult time going through the stand. As a crown fire, they tend to drop to the surface. And so they don't kill all the trees. They kill a few and they let some new trees in. So they're very much mixed age stands. And in this photo on the towards the right here, you see some 100-year-old white pines on that little peninsula in the background, and then the peninsula in the foreground, 200-year-old trees, and on the far left, even 300- and 400-year-old trees in mixed age stands of trees that have had several fires during the life of the oldest trees. And here's a red pine on fire at the base, and they can burn like that or be exposed to the radiant heat of a high-intensity fire for up to 25 minutes before it will kill the live tissue under the bark. So these trees are extremely well adapted to an understory or surface fire regime. And then you see 9 years later, those charred trees are still in perfectly good health. If they did get a fire scar, they seal it with pitch so that the fungi won't rot the whole tree. And as I said, they can live 100, 200, 300 more years after being fire scarred. And then in the bottom picture, you see Bud's wife, Fran Heinzelman, examining the 9-year-old reproduction there of red pine 9 years post-fire. Fires in the boreal forest burn different areas essentially at random because of where lightning strikes occur, and also at random with respect to stand age. It's not true that young stands are less likely to burn. Young stands of jack pine in particular or spruce can carry a fire when they're only 5 years old. And sometimes, just by chance, there will be 2 burns within a short time, which means within 20 or 30 years. And at the time of the second fire, the conifers are not old enough to bear seeds, and therefore they are wiped out, and aspen and birch can take over because their seeds can float on the wind for miles. And that happened in the black area on this map, which burned in 1864 and then again in 1871. So there was a lot of birch and aspen in there, and that wasn't second growth forest, it was just natural birch and aspen. And then there's some areas that get skipped just by chance, just like some burn twice in a short time. Others don't burn for 200 or 300 years, and here's a jack pine stand that's 190 years old. And the little olive green trees along the shore of the lake here are white cedar, a late successional species, which is starting to move in by this age. And you see right in the middle here the narrow spire of a black spruce that after 190 years is finally caught up with the jack pines in height growth by poking along at a few inches per year. It finally caught up with the jack pine. So these old stands still have a lot of seeds until they're a little bit over 200, and then after that there may not be many jack pine seeds, and it would be a whole different successional trajectory if they were to burn. So that's Heinzelman's classic work in a nutshell. Most of the landscape burns in big fires, high intensity, from 20 to 150 years apart. And that regenerates jack pine and black spruce. If they burn at less than 20-year intervals, then you get some aspen. There's no fire for a very long time, then you get a mixture of spruce, fir, birch, and cedar, which are the late successional species. And believe it or not, birch is not only early, but also late successional in the boundary waters. It does make a comeback in gaps in old forests that are 200 years old and older, as well as reproduce massively after forest fires. And then there are these areas with mixed fire regimes with rugged topography that tend to be white and red pine that have surface fires. And so the trees are fire scarred and the stands are uneven aged rather than even aged, like the jack pine and black spruce. Okay, so that's Bud Heinzelman's classic work. Here's some new work that's been done in the Center for Dendrochronology, which is in the Geography Department at the University of Minnesota. So dendrochronologists study tree rings, and you see here Lane Johnson, who did what I'm going to show you as his master's thesis, and you see him next to a fire scar there on a red pine, and he was able to find a number of red pines on Loch LaCroix that had fallen over, and take a slab from the fallen log, date the fire scars, and he found a historical human-caused fire regime that occupies part of the landscape. So Native American burning and also burning by fur traders along the international border route was a different disturbance regime from the late 1500s to around the year 1900. And this is part of Lac LaCroix here, and you see all the white dots, which represent red pine logs where the tree had fallen over, but there was a fire scar. So he was able to take a slab and date the fire scars in all of these places. And here's what he found. Because some of the trees had multiple scars, he could get the average interval between fires as witnessed by individual trees. And the fire intervals range from 2 to 150 years, as you see on this graph, but there's a really clear mode. In other words, 20 to 24 years was the most abundant interval between these fires. So they were multi-age stands. They were mostly red pine. They had frequent fires, mostly every 20 to 24 years, but sometimes closer than that and sometimes further apart than that. And so this is what those forests look like, and what we think was happening here from these 79 different fires that were recorded from 1590 to 2010 in a 5,000 acre area. There were 61 fires that only occurred at one single spot on the landscape, 18 that occurred at 2 to 5 different sites. They were spatially and temporally asynchronous. In other words, one spot could burn in a given year and another place a quarter mile away did not burn. So these were not huge fires. They were small. They were fairly low in intensity. They were not associated with droughts. So they occurred in non-drought years, which is pretty good evidence that they were set by people, because the Native Americans were aware of what would happen if you lit the forest on fire in a drought year. So we think it was burning by Native Americans, and to some extent the fur traders. 20 to 24 years is the most common fire interval, and they probably did it to maintain an open stands, especially on south-facing slopes that would get breezes in the summer, and in the winter the low angle of the sun would come in underneath, so they would get breeze in the summer and be warmer than average in the winter. And they also did the burning to maintain blueberries. So that fire regime caused by humans occupied a small proportion of the landscape, whereas the rest of it was occupied by the other disturbance regimes that I talked about, the big high-intensity fires every 50 to 100 years, and the moderately sized, moderately intense surface fires in the red and white pine. Okay, so we've got different fire regimes and different parts of the landscape, and now we're going to put wind on top of that, because we know trees also blow down, and there are storms in northern Minnesota, as you can see here. A big wave crashing near Tetagouche State Park in northern Minnesota. So obviously it would take high wind to do that. And we also get these storms called derechos, or straight line winds, which are severe thunderstorms that have these bow echoes or supercell derechos. And this one crossed half the continent. Like all good things, it started in Fargo, North Dakota there in the morning, and then it around 9 by 10 o'clock, it was moving through north central Minnesota. Between noon and 1, it went through the boundary waters. And then by 5 a.m. the next morning, it was already in Maine. So this thunderstorm is moving at a tremendously high speed. When it reached its maximum intensity right over the boundary waters, and there were sustained winds as high as 120 miles an hour for about 20 minutes as the storm passed by any given location. So tens of millions of trees were flattened. The red on this map of the boundary water shows the areas that were heavily damaged. The Trout Lake unit in the central part of the boundary waters from Ely to the Gunflint Trail, and then going off into Canada, and of course all the way through through Montreal and then into Maine by the following morning. Here is a before and after picture of forest, and you can see it's pretty well flattened, but it still looks pretty green, even in the post blowdown on the right. And all that green you see, those are the small shade-tolerant species of trees like balsam fir, black spruce, which can regenerate after fires, but it can also regenerate in the shade and have seedlings in the shade standing by in case there's a windstorm, and it can be released from suppression when the big trees die. And white cedar. So balsam fir, black spruce, and white cedar are that green there that you see in the understory, and now they're free to grow because the big trees were killed. In fact, the windstorm pushed succession ahead by 50 years because the trees in the understory don't have to wait for decades after this windstorm for these other trees above them to die so they can get a spot in the canopy. The big trees were knocked over all at once, releasing these. In the upper picture, you see black spruce there and a few balsam fir. In the lower picture, you see white cedar seedlings. And you also see a white cedar tree there at the edge of, on the shore of Seagull Lake, which is the middle tree there, is 550 years old. According to analysis at the Dendrochronology Center, I cored the tree and sent them a core. So that tree survived many fires and the blowdown because it's such a short tree and has such a low center of gravity. There is not much for the wind to push on, but it still produced plenty of seedlings, as you can see. So the wind is actually a selective weeding of the forest. Certain species of trees are more resilient to wind than others, and that includes things like white cedar and paper birch and red maple, trees with very strong wind, trees that can bend without breaking, or trees that have short stature, and also the small saplings of black spruce and balsam fir, which are like Christmas trees sitting right on the ground when they're young, so the young ones in the understory tend to survive. And so you end up with a lot of small spruce and fir, some big and small cedar trees and birch trees, and the jack pine and aspen is pretty much gone, and a lot of the red and white pine as well. So it's a selective weeding of the forest. And if you look at jack pine stands, so this is work that I did now following up on Bud Heinzelman. We looked at several hundred stands of jack pine or other species of pine. And in the case of jack pine, there was divergent succession. So the wind blew down hundreds of different jack pine stands across the boundary waters. Some of them succeeded to black spruce, some to white cedar, and some to balsam fir, and that depended on which of those seedling species were in the understory at the time that the big pines were knocked over. So divergent succession with wind. One forest type becomes three forest types, but none of them are jack pine. Okay, so that's the wind. Now let's go on to another aspect here, which is the return of big fire in the 21st century. So one thing I didn't tell you earlier was that from about 1910 to the 1990s, there was hardly any fire in the boundary waters. And Bud Heinzelman was wondering if the whole thing was going to succeed to balsam fir and white cedar because of a lack of fire. But what happened now, years after he died, is that big fires have returned. It started with the Sag Corridor fire in 1995 and then continued with the Cavity Lake fire of 2006, Ham Lake 2007, Pagami Creek 2011, numerous other smaller fires, and of course, just outside the boundary waters, the Greenwood fire this summer. So here's the Cavity Lake fire. It's a wildfire. It's ignited by lightning in the middle of the wilderness, and each day is a different color here. So it started at the symbol, first burned that dark purple area, then the lighter purple, then the brown, then the red, and the yellow on successive days. So you can see it had no trouble here crossing Seagull Lake by jumping from island to island on the third day, shown in the brown color there. And this was my former PhD student and postdoc at this time, Roy Rich, who was out on 3 Mile Island in Seagull Lake, and the Forest Service said, oh, don't worry about the fire. And then the fire blew up very suddenly, and he had to make an escape here against 40-mile-an-hour wind, because the fire developed such an updraft, it was pulling wind into the fire from every direction. So if you wanted to get away from fire, you had to go against a 40-mile-an-hour wind. Obviously, he survived because I have the picture. And here's one of his pictures when he stopped and looked back of the fire jumping from island to island across Seagull Lake. That flame you see in the middle there, that's actually like a 300-foot tall flame in blowdown slash, so 100 tons per acre of dry and dead and down trees. And when a gust of wind would come, that flame would just point sideways and a big chunk of it would jump over to the next island, sometimes crossing a half a mile of water. And so blowdown followed by fire really made a big transition in the forest. This forest here was spruce and jack pine for thousands of years. After being blown down and then burned, what all the regeneration you see there is cherry. And later on, it came in with birch and aspen. So that created a whole different successional trajectory. Oh, here's a mystery plant. So after the Cavity Lake fire, high intensity fire during a drought and a heat wave in July. And a few weeks later, big swaths of the landscape are covered with this plant, which is a plant that every one of you probably knows, whether you know its name or not. You see them all the time, you step on them all the time. So it is actually largely faster. So what the previous picture showed is what largely faster does after a fire and it gets full sunlight. Instead of just having these big heart-shaped leaves on the forest floor and never blooming, each plant sends up a stalk 4 feet high and gets 100 flowers. So they really, as the expression goes, make hay when the sun shines, because they're not going to see the sun again until the next fire. They're just going to persist as these shade-tolerant leaves on the forest floor until the next fire. So a lot of surprises when you go in and study these areas after a fire. And then here's the Ham Lake fire the next year. This is the one that's highlighted in the book, Gunflint Burning. So it started just south of the Gunflint Trail. It burned to the west. It burned the dark blue area here at the Seagull Lake, where I happened to be on a wilderness trip. And the whole story of that is told in Gunflint Burning if you're interested, because Carrie Griffith, who wrote the book, tells the story, my story, better than I do. Crossed into Canada here, then came back into the United States a few days later. Total of 72,000 acres burned here. And this was a May fire, so an early spring fire just a few days after ice out. And here is Lane Kennedy and Gus Axelson at the Seagull Palisades where we were camping, and this is midnight. And the ball of flame here above Gus's head in the green coat there is Wilderness Canoe Base, which lost a number of buildings. They did manage to get the sprinkler on the main lodge, but they lost a bunch of other buildings. And above Lane's head there's some lit up areas there, that was Wilderness Canoe Outfitters. That's where our cars were. But when we finally got out, we went there and our cars were sitting there in perfect shape with a sprinkler on them, and they were in a black moonscape. But the outfitter had put a sprinkler on our cars before evacuating. And here's the aftermath. As is typical of spring fires, the death of trees was patchy. Some trees were consumed by fire, some were scorched by heat and turned brown, and some trees are still green and alive. So that's a difference between spring fire and fires that you get in mid to late summer, which tend to be more uniformly high severity. And here's the Pagami Creek fire of 2011. And again, every color is a different day. So up here in the northwest corner, it smoldered for days and days until it made its big run on a day with high winds and ran 17 miles. And down below, you can see satellite images. You can see the actual flames on a satellite image. And there's the smoke, pyrocumulus cloud, which is water released by the fire. So carbohydrate is turned into water and carbon dioxide by the fire very rapidly. With the updraft, you get a pyrocumulus cloud, and then 3 days later, there's the smoke going over Poland and the Ukraine. And here's the Pagami Creek fire, the imprint of it, 92,000 acres. And notice that the Lake Isabella there split the fire head, and then it rained, and the two heads never came back together into one head. And then if you look up to the upper right, you see the Cavity Lake and Ham Lake burn areas from 5 to 6 years earlier. So lots of fire scars on the landscape scale here. How big is the Pagami Creek fire, which is our biggest fire in 100 years? Well, here it is at the same scale as the 1864 fire and the 1875 fire. So it's still pretty small. In fact, at 145 square miles, it was smaller than quite a number of the pre-European settlement fires that Bud Heinzelman documented. Cavity Lake was 50 square miles. The Greenwood Lake fire was about the same. I think it was 45 or 46 square miles. So these are big fires for us, but they're still not big compared to some of the big historic fires that were documented by Bud Heinzelman. Looking at annual area burned and the fire cycle in the pre-settlement times, it was 0.8% per year, 122-year cycle to burn an area equivalent to the whole. During the settlement era, fires were more frequent. 87-year fire cycle, a little more than 1% burning a year. And then look at in 1911 and 1972, 0.5% or 1/20% actually burning per year, a 2,000-year fire cycle. And then looking at the contemporary from 1973 to 2021, we're back to a 200-year fire cycle, and just looking at 2000 to 2021, 100-year. So we're getting back to the same fire cycle as we had in pre-settlement times now. And that's probably due to climate change, among other factors. So summary of the successional pathways here. What have we learned from these big fires? We've put out over 1,000 plots to study these recent fires that have returned while looking at A here, jack pine, aspen, and red white pine forests. In Heinzelman's classic work, they followed the solid arrows. Red and white pine would burn and stay red and white pine. Same with aspen. Every once in a while, a jack pine stand would burn and become aspen and birch. Jack pine would basically burn and stay jack pine. But what we found is that everything is converging to aspen and birch now, whether it starts as aspen and birch or whether it starts as jack pine or starts as red and white pine. In these big recent fires, a lot of them converted to aspen and birch. The wind, as I mentioned earlier, has divergent pathways. So whether you start as jack pine or aspen, birch, or red and white pine, it could go to spruce, fir, or cedar. For any of those three, they could diverge to three different stand types. And with the wind plus fire, or multiple fires in a short time, no matter what stand type you're starting out as, whether it's one of the fire types like the pines or a late successional type like fir or cedar, it's all converted into aspen and birch. So that's probably a climate change effect, and we're getting more compound disturbances of wind followed by fire and more short intervals between fires. They're finding the same thing in Alaska, where in that case it's black spruce being converted to birch and aspen. So that's the big difference. Fires are more likely now to create birch and aspen and stands, and less likely to create pine stands. Wind fire combinations more common, although even just single fires are also creating birch aspen. Going into the future, if we look at the biome distribution, so the boundary waters is boreal forest. If you look at the current biomes here, and this is some research that recently came from my program at the university. So the blue is boreal forest there in northeastern Minnesota. The green is mixed boreal and temperate. The yellow is broadleaf temperate deciduous like maple, sugar maple, oak, basswood, and so on. So it's a boreal climate right now. If we go on a low emission scenario, that recedes a little bit, but it's still boreal and mixed boreal temperate in the boundary waters. But if we go on the business as usual scenario for CO2 emissions, by 2070, we could expect most of Minnesota to have a climate that supports prairie, like 90% of the state. And the tip of the arrowhead would support broadleaf forest, as in sugar maple, basswood, red maple, and oak. So no boreal forest to speak of. If you want to look at that as an analog, so here's the boundary waters right now at the blue star. What's a place that has a climate right now like the boundary waters would have by 2070 for that business as usual scenario? And the answer is Granite Falls, Minnesota. So what does it look like there? Well, here's the boundary waters. And by the way, Granite Falls has very similar physiography to the boundary waters. Old, billions of years old granitic rocks. So here's the boundary waters, mostly black spruce forest in this picture of fire origin. And if you do nothing other than make the summers about 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, keep the soils the same, keep everything else the same, just make the summers 8 degrees warmer, you get this. And you see oaks and patches of prairie mixed together there. And if we go on that pathway, oak savanna would mean a transition from infrequent high-intensity fire, like we have in the boundary waters today, to much more frequent low-intensity fire, which is characteristic of oak savannas. So that's our big journey for today, from Heinzelman over the last 400 years to the absence of fire, the return of big fires, how are the big fires regenerating today, and where might we go in the future? And thanks to the Environment Trust Fund, the National Park Service, and all the people listed there who helped with the research or who donated money to fund the research. And then in the picture here, you see the current boreal forest in the boundary waters, and David Luke took these pictures and he digitally erased the boreal forest above the water and replaced it with an oak savanna. So you can see an oak savanna reflected as a boreal forest there to highlight the alternative futures depending on choices we make today about CO2 emissions and climate change. And he has an interesting presentation where he shows lots of those images from throughout the boundary waters. Maybe he can present that to you at some point. Anyway, do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do.
So I can stop share here and see if people have questions.
I guess I have
so
a question. So you said what's going to happen as far as the trees go. I mean, do you think that a little further? What's going to be the effect on everything else? You know, the animals and everything like that. And I know some areas of Minnesota have in the past gone the other way, because I was down southern Minnesota, which used to be, some areas used to be savanna, and now it's thick forest because there's not the fires that there used to be.
Yeah, well, let me address that first. If you look at the prairie forest border at the time of European settlement, it goes on a diagonal across Minnesota from northwest to southeast. And if you noticed in my map of the current biomes right now, the prairie is pushed way out to the Dakotas. Even Iowa is now a forest climate. That's because in the early phase of warming climate, we've been getting, on average, not this year, but on average, if you take a 10 or 20-year average, it's a substantial increase in precipitation. So the climate envelope that supports temperate deciduous forest has pushed way out to the west, 100 miles further to the west than it was 100 years ago. So right now it's really hard to maintain prairie remnants, and forest wants to grow there, but with that business as usual scenario, that will sweep back to the east, and it will not stop where it was 100 years ago. It could go all the way up to Grand Marais. So that's that part of the question. The other part of the question, what would happen to everything else? And the answer is when the trees change, everything else changes. All the smaller plant species would change, the insects would change, the birds would change. Moose, of course, would be replaced by deer, bobcat, or lynx would be replaced by bobcat. So wildlife is totally dependent on the vegetation type, and so when the trees are replaced by other trees or by grasslands, the wildlife would be as well. Let's see, and I see there's some questions in the chat box here. Is there enough soil to be an oak savanna? Wouldn't it be way more rocky? And the answer to that is that it is very rocky at Granite Falls, Minnesota, and savanna grows there. It's just that the trees are growing in crevices in the bedrock. And you're right, you won't be able to grow trees all across the rock surface. You can only grow trees on a slab of rock in a cold climate. And moss can grow on the rocks and the trees can grow in the moss. When you warm up the climate, the trees will be restricted to small pockets of deeper soil. But it will still be like a savanna. They'll just have a lot of rock outcrops in it. And here's a comment, what a wealth of information. Amazing to think red pines can live for hundreds of years after a fire. Yep. But don't try that in a city. If you scar it, if you whack the base of a tree with a lawnmower in the city, it will die in a few years. But if it's damaged at the base in a natural process like fire in a forest, it can live for hundreds of years. So trees are adapted to natural injuries. They're not adapted to the injuries that people cause.
I have a question about the CO2. I know trees absorb CO2 and it help the environment. So will this, like in Minnesota, will that go down, the CO2 absorption, or increase? Or
well, that's a good question. So the CO2 is absorbed by trees. If we go on the reduced emission scenario, trees will continue to take a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester that CO2 as wood for a long time. But if we don't, because it depends on what the rest of the world does, we are actually one of the northern Minnesota across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta is one of the tipping points for the planet listed by the IPCC report. In other words, all the boreal forests from Minnesota all the way across to Edmonton, Alberta, would be killed, and all of those trees would burn, and that would all be emitted as CO2, and that would accelerate warming even more. So yeah, the situation in Minnesota is that we'll either go towards more trees or we will go very rapidly to all prairie. It's hard to see an in-between for Minnesota. It's going to run one way or another. And it mostly depends on what the rest of the world does, because we don't emit most of the CO2 in the world in Minnesota. It's everybody in the world. So if we do the reduced emission scenario, Minnesota will look much like it does today. And if we don't, then get used to being the new Kansas. Maybe you won't live to 2070, but your children and grandchildren will.
Another question on the trees. Was that carbon dating they did on the trees to determine which tree came from which fire, and or how did they
that
do
was all tree ring dating that Heinzelman did, and also the work that Lane Johnson did to look at those human fire regimes along the international border route. That was all tree ring data. Yeah.
Oh, so you could actually do that.
Carbon dating can date older things. For example, we know that 7,500 years ago, at the peak of this interglacial, it was much warmer in the summer than it is right now. And there was prairie grasses in the Ely area, and a lot more oak pollen than there is today. So we already know that northern Minnesota trended towards an oak savanna the last time summers were quite warm. So it happened before, it can happen again. That would be carbon dating and looking at pollen deep in layers in sediment.
Thanks.
Anyone else have any questions? Well, they're a quiet bunch.
Yeah, well, they're all worried that we're going to go on that high CO2 emission trajectory.
Well, I have another question for you. So during the Ham Lake fire, when you were out on the lake, how bad was it getting for you guys? Because I wasn't sure in the book whether whether it was really bad or whether you kind of knew where it was going. Or
We didn't have a clue where the fire was going. I mean, the best you can do when you're on a wilderness trip and there's a big wildfire is climb to the top of hills, and what you can see from there is pretty limited. So when the fire first started, we were on 3 Mile Island in the middle of Seagull Lake. And as we left that island, we looked back and saw this little plume of smoke. The fire had just ignited. So we decided to go out to Eagle's Nest Island, which is, I don't know, half a mile, 3/4 of a mile out into Seagull, because there's a tall bluff there, so we could climb up the bluff and look and see what was happening. By the time we got there, the whole sky was dark in just 30 minutes. And there was a 40-mile-an-hour wind blowing. The fire was adding to the normal winds, which were already quite strong. And the fire was just roaring straight towards us at a high rate of speed, and we decided we had to get to the north side of Seagull. And so we crossed Seagull Lake in huge waves, and it was only 3 days after ice out. So if you capsized, you died, right? Because the water was 34 degrees. And I was in the canoe with Gus Axelson, who at that time was the editor of the Conservation Volunteer magazine. And he said, I have a 2-year-old kid at home who I want to see again. And I said, well, that's fine with me. You know, I hope we make it. And we did make it to the north side of the lake. We crashed there, and then we decided to set up camp at the Palisades. There's a campsite right behind the Palisades. We were stuck there for 3 days, and that whole time it was like snowing, like gray, puffy ash on us. And we had a lot of smoke. I thought we might die from smoke inhalation, but it turns out wildfire smoke is not as bad as building smoke that's burning plastic and all sorts of toxic stuff. So when we would blow our nose, we'd have black boogers, but basically it wasn't all that bad. It was just not knowing when we would ever be able to move out of that campsite because of the wind and because our potential route was blocked by the fire. And finally, on the third day, the wind settled down and we got out and we went down the Seagull River, and the east side of the river was on fire. While we were getting out of the canoe, it jumped over our heads. It threw a flaming pine cone and it landed in a balsam fir on the east side of the river, and that torched up, and then the fire continued on its merry way on the west side of the river. The east side was on fire while we were paddling down the river and getting out of the canoe, and then jumped over our heads and went on the west side of the river and burned the Trails End campground. And at that point, a hotshot crew came and asked if I was Lee, and I said yes. He said, "We've been wondering what happened to you in the last 3 days." And I said, "Well, you shouldn't have worried, because I teach a forest fire ecology and behavior class, and didn't have to worry that I didn't know what to do." But they escorted us to our cars and then down to the Gunflint Lodge, which was the headquarters for the fire command, where I was shoved up in front of about 10 TV cameras to get a story about the fire ecologist who was trapped in a fire. And actually Gus and Lane and I, so Lane is a world famous photographer. We actually had a contract to write an article about climate change in the boreal forest for Backpacker magazine, and then the fire happened, so we ended up getting 5 pages in Backpacker magazine with Lane's absolutely spectacular photographs of the fire, and Gus's really elegant writing, and my information about the ecology and about the fire behavior. It was quite the experience. While we were driving out, the telephone poles were on fire. You had to worry about whether each one was going to fall across the road in front of you. So you look at each one and then drive past it and then look at the next one. Very interesting experience. So the book is, somebody typed the title of the book there, Gunflint Burning. And let's see here, there's some other questions. Let's see. People are eliminating balsams in the Ely area and other northeast Minnesota. That's to reduce the intensity of fire as it approaches an area with buildings. So, and that will reduce the intensity of the fire. If there's extreme fire behavior, like if it's an exceptional drought and the wind is 40 miles an hour, it won't make any difference. But if the fire conditions are not the most severe, it will make a difference. So most of the time it will make a difference, and it'll make it easier to save buildings if you've taken out the balsam fir for 100 feet around the building. So yes, they're selectively eliminating balsams. I was up to Ely 2 weeks ago and saw some of those cuttings. It's called the High-Low Project. They got some sort of a grant to take the balsam fir understory out and leave the big pines up above, so that fires have to drop down to the surface. And some comments.
This is Judy, and I used to own property just outside of Grand Marais, and the conventional wisdom was that the birches were the early succession trees, and we had so many, dead birches along along the Highway 61. And then they were succeeded by the conifers. But what you're saying is kind of the opposite, is that the birches and the aspens are going to eventually succeed most of the conifers.
Yeah, in the future with fires and with blowdown and fire combinations, birch and aspen will take over the landscape. With regard to the successional status of birch, it's both early and late successional. In other words, it can come in after fires or it can come in after wind followed by fire, but it can persist in a 200-year-old forest in gaps when individual trees die in very old forests. Because on that rocky terrain, the canopy is never so dense over a large area that there isn't some sunlight coming through, and birch trees can pop up into those gaps even though they require sun. And we discovered that those birches that come into those old forests are totally rooted in rotting wood. So like they were rooted in, because you'd think they would die of drought because they're growing on a slab of granite, and birch roots are incredibly sensitive to heat and drought. But it turns out these were growing in rotting wood where it was probably a pine that germinated 500 or 600 years ago and got to be 300 years old and blew down 300 years ago. And now it's this really big piece of rotting wood that's melded into the forest floor, and the root systems of the birch trees on that shield country there in the boundary waters were all completely confined to big pieces of rotting wood from hundreds of years ago. On the North Shore, it's a different story because you have sediment on top of the rock. There is exposed rock, but the birch trees are growing in areas where there's some soil.
Yes.
And
it wasn't great soil. It's gravel mixed with clay.
Yeah, gravel mixed with clay, but it will grow birch trees. And so many of the trees died there because from 2000 to 2012, there were a lot of droughts. There was a major drought in 2002 and 2006, 2007, 2010, 2012. And the roots of the birch trees basically got too hot during those long, dry summers, and that killed the trees. Because they are just incredibly sensitive to that. And some young birch is coming back there, but you have to wonder how long it'll be or whether a lot of it would have died this summer. I was up to Lake Vermilion in July this year, and the paper birch had lost its leaves already in about the 20th of July because of the drought.
And the heat.
And the heat, yep. So, yeah. And speaking of heat, there's hardly any fall color in Minnesota this year. And so people said, well, go east into Wisconsin. So I was just at my cabin on the Door Peninsula in Lake Michigan, and they have had a normal amount of rainfall through the summer. I mean, they almost had a drought develop in June, but then they started getting rain. So at this point, they've had a normal amount of rain if you go from May through October. And there's no fall color there either. And that is because it was so hot. It was the hottest summer ever recorded. It tops 1936 and 1933. So hot that there was so much more evaporation that a normal amount of rainfall was not enough to keep the trees from drought stress. So those trees in those areas that had normal rainfall were still under severe drought stress because there was so much more evaporation than normal.
The Wisconsin maples were glorious about 2 weeks ago when I drove, clear across the state from Minneapolis down to Chicago, and now I'm in Florida. That was part of my trek. That was the best part of the trek, was the glorious. I had no idea there were so many maples in Wisconsin.
Oh yeah,
I did that drive.
But if you were to drive straight east across northern Wisconsin, there's this no fall color. When you get in that route going down to the south, you get into deep soils with a lot of silt. deep silt loams that can hold several inches of water in the soil. But going across northern Wisconsin, no color. And the trees are all under drought stress, even though they had a normal amount of rain. So that's why we're predicting the big change if we go on the business as usual CO2 trajectory. An average summer will be warmer than this summer by 2070. In fact, twice as far above normal as this summer was. And even if we get more rain than we're getting now, the trees will still be under severe drought stress all the time with those temperatures.
So there was another question in the chat, Lee. It says, what are you working on next?
Oh, what am I working on next? I'm working on the jumping worm invasion,
Okay.
which is the newest earthworm invasion. It's the Asian species of worms, and they are a disaster in forests. They cause the soil to erode away. They change the soil into little pellets like cat litter that don't stick to each other, and it just washes away in heavy rain. So, so far we've only found infested forests around the metro area. But it's only a matter of time until they start spreading elsewhere. Yeah, I'm still working on, of course, on the impact of climate change and multiple factors that interact with climate change, like deer and earthworms and all sorts of factors of change working together. And here's a question: what's the best way we can help prevent human-caused climate change? Well, reduce CO2 emissions. So that means energy conservation, fuel-efficient cars, fuel-efficient buildings, switching to alternative sources of energy, which I think will be the biggest generator of jobs in the next several decades, is to redo the energy system, and planting trees. Of course, there are 2.2 billion acres of land on this planet that used to be forested that are not forested now. 2.2 billion acres is the size of the United States. Planting 1 trillion trees on that amount of land over the next 20 years would take about 100 parts per million out of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So switching to renewable energy, planting those trees, it's only like 120 trees per person over 20 years. We can do that. And so alternative energy, planting trees to draw down the CO2, emit less CO2, and then energy conservation, have more energy efficient cars and buildings and so on, all at the same time.
Is there a problem with the animal-created methane in the atmosphere too? Is that like a lot of, yeah.
Yeah, methane is a problem, especially the leaking methane from wells and mines and stuff in Russia, and methane coming out of the tundra, which is starting to thaw now. Methane is natural gas, in case you didn't know that. So yeah, methane is also a problem. We need to take care of that, but if we start using more renewable energy instead of natural gas, that problem will take care of itself. It actually gets oxidized to CO2 in about 10 years in the atmosphere. But in the meantime, it's like 100 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2 during that 10 years that it persists in the atmosphere.
Okay, any last questions? Everyone's quiet. I think we got it covered. So thanks very much for the presentation, Lee. I know the whole question of climate change gets into a whole other lot of topics.
Yep.
So
yeah, I can do a whole presentation on just that. Actually, I can do 10 presentations on just that, but
yeah,
it's so closely related to fire though that I had to put a little bit of it in here, but
yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, thanks, Lee.